Her mouth was not covered with cloth. It was not gagged by rope or silenced by threat. It was sewn, needle to flesh, stitch by stitch, through the lips of a living woman. A coarse black thread pulled tight, crossing the curve of her face like a signature written in violence. Each puncture left a bead of blood, small but deliberate, until her mouth was no longer a mouth, but a sealed wound. No scream, no prayer, no final words. Only breath, shallow and shaking through her nose, and the tremor of skin trying not to flinch as metal passed through it again. They had decided she would die voiceless. Not because her voice failed her, but because it had reached too many. The body stood in the square, waiting for the scaffold to be assembled, but it was her silence that had already done its work. Spectators arrived not to hear what she would say, but to marvel at what she no longer could. Children pointed, clergy looked away, soldiers stood still. She blinked slowly, the only remaining motion that belonged to her. All else, her limbs, her posture, her dignity, was now held by the state. But her eyes said what her mouth could not. You fear what I might have spoken more than you fear what I have done. There had been others who died that week. Rebels, thieves, men caught in plots too careless to conceal. They were hanged, shot, displayed. But she was altered first. The mutilation came before the killing. This was not ordinary execution. This was a ritual silencing, an act not of justice but of terror dressed in ceremony. And it invites a question that history rarely answers. What truth did they fear she would utter? What name? What secret? What accusation? Because no one sews a mouth shut unless they are more terrified of the sentence than the scream. Her name was not always cursed. Once it moved quietly through markets and monasteries, passed in whispers across city walls, not shouted, not printed, but carried in murmurs. A woman, they said, who did not fear bishops, who wrote what should not be written, who spoke not as a servant, but as one already condemned. She was not royalty, nor priest, nor warrior. She had no claim to blood or inheritance. What she had, what they feared, was speech sharpened into defiance. A woman with no army but her voice. A voice that did not stutter, did not kneel, did not flatter. Her writings first emerged as warnings, letters, unsigned, written in a brutal clarity that named not sins, but systems. She accused not individuals, but institutions. She wrote of the cruelty hidden behind altars, of taxes that starved the poor while cathedrals rose skyward, of men who blessed executions with the same hands they used to bless bread. Her language was not poetic, it was surgical. She dissected the justifications of power and left them twitching on the page, and that, more than any sword or flame, unsettled those who read her. She did not hide. When asked if she authored the words, she admitted it. When summoned by magistrates, she arrived without counsel. When threatened, she did not apologize. They labeled her heretic, dissident, temptress, witch. The names changed, but the motive remained the same, to make her voice illegitimate. Yet each accusation fed her myth. Her refusal became a kind of liturgy for others, women, widows, workers, who saw in her not just rebellion, but relief. Someone was speaking what they could not, and that made her dangerous, not because she incited rebellion, but because she exposed the rotting architecture behind obedience. Her arrest came at night, no formal charge, no trial, just a disappearance. She was taken to a fortress no one named aloud. There, the machinery began. She was not beaten, at least not in ways that left bruises. Instead, they starved her of sensation. No conversation, no time, no light, just interrogations, demands to name others, to recant, to kneel, to become small, but she did not. When asked why she had written what she wrote, she answered simply, because it was true. The interrogators changed. One spoke with kindness, one with rage, one with promises. But she remained the same. Her silence was not passive, it was calculated. Her refusal to answer their distortions forced them to see themselves, and in that reflection they flinched. Eventually, word of her survival leaked, that she was alive, that she had not confessed, that the regime had failed to break her. Crowds began to gather outside prisons. The writings returned, now copied by hand, smuggled beneath skirts, painted on walls. The state felt it, not in armies or assassins, but in the loss of narrative. She was becoming more than a prisoner. She was becoming a symbol, and symbols once born are notoriously hard to execute. So they revised the plan. She would still die, but without words. Because if she spoke before death, she might fracture the illusion of guilt. She might name names. She might expose not only cruelty, but fear. And so they prepared the ritual. A final act of erasure disguised as justice, not to kill her voice, but to sew it shut. It began not with the needle, but with the architecture of silence. Before a stitch pierced her skin, they had already begun the dismantling of her voice, not just physically, but ideologically, socially, spiritually. They took her name first, refused to speak it during meetings, omitted it from transcripts, replaced it with phrases like the accused or the woman. She was referred to in the third person, even when present, as though she were already gone, as though the silencing had already succeeded. She was held underground in a windowless cell, lit only by the rhythm of footsteps above. They denied her time. Meals arrived irregularly, sometimes not at all. She was forbidden from speaking aloud, even in prayer. When she murmured to herself, they removed all write-in tools, then her bedding, then her bucket. A voice, they believed, needed tools, so they took them. What they could not take was her presence. Even in silence, she was visible, too visible. And so one morning, the order was given, not to kill her yet, but to make her unrecognizable. They brought in a surgeon, not one trained in mercy, but in message, the kind who had stitched traitors' tongues to their chins, who had sewn false smiles onto the faces of the condemned. He carried no scalpel, only a needle thick and unclean, and black thread stained by the rust of old iron. She was told to kneel. When she refused, they forced her down. The procedure was not medical, it was symbolic. A soldier held her head, another pried open her mouth. She did not scream, she stared. The first stitch passed through her upper lip, just right of center, then the lower. Flesh gave way not with rupture, but with a sound like fabric tearing. She gasped, but could not cry out. The second stitch crossed diagonally. The third locked the corners. The fourth pierced old scar tissue from a childhood fall. By the seventh, the thread was taut, and her mouth, a place of fire, of protest, of dangerous language, was now a seal. Blood pooled along her chin. She could not spit, she could only breathe, shallow and wet. They did not bandage the wounds, they wanted them visible. When she was brought into daylight, when the crowd gathered, they would see what had been done. The punishment was not execution. The punishment was silence made visible, a warning to all who might believe their own voice sacred. They dressed her in rough fabric, gray, heavy, common, no insignia, no mark of distinction. Her feet were bare, her hands bound behind her. She walked not toward a scaffold, but toward spectacle. The square was not prepared for justice, it was prepared for theater. She was not the first to be executed, but she was the first to be sewn. No priest dared approach her, no confession was taken. Her final absolution had been replaced by the assumption of guilt. She could not protest, she could not forgive, she could not explain. The court declared that her silence was an admission, that the stitched mouth was a symbol of submission. But the people saw something else. They saw defiance. They saw a mutilated woman forced into ritual and wrapped in false meaning. A hush fell as she ascended the platform. Even children stopped fidgeting. The executioner read a decree. It echoed, hollow and tired, against the stone walls. She did not flinch. Her head remained upright. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for allies, not for rescue, but to bear witness, to prove that she could still see. She stood not as a heretic, nor a traitor, nor a broken woman. She stood as a warning. Not to speak may be safer, but it is not survival. Because even as the blade was prepared, even as the rope was measured, even as the hammer was raised to drive the final peg, every eye remained on her mouth. Not because it was closed, but because they feared what might have emerged had it stayed open. There is a cruelty deeper than death. It is the denial of last words, not by chaos or speed or war, but by design. She was led to the scaffold in full daylight, her sewn mouth already swollen, the black thread now stiffened by dried blood. Each step she took drew no cries of rage from the crowd, only an uncanny silence, as if something unnatural stood before them. She had not been gagged. She had not been bound by cloth. She had been stitched, and everyone present could see the thread, crossing her lips like a mark of plague. The officials read her sentence again, though none expected her to respond. They spoke of treason, of subversion, of dangerous ideas spread through ink and voice. They called her incorrigible. They called her deluded. But the people watching saw something different. They saw the human body weaponized against itself, not just bound or bruised, but reshaped to enforce silence. Her punishment had already occurred. The execution was now just punctuation. She was positioned upright. No blindfold, no priest. Her hands were tied before her, not behind, as if to simulate surrender. The scaffold creaked under her weight. The wind moved her hair across her bloodied chin. The executioner waited for a signal, but none came. Her eyes did not move. She gave no nod, no prayer, no flinch, just a steady, hollow gaze across the mass of watching faces, some grimacing, some weeping, most simply watching in a fear too quiet to name. And yet, even in her immobility, she was speaking, not through voice, but through denial. The refusal to break, the refusal to perform the death they had staged for her. They had sewn her mouth not to silence a scream, but to deny her the ritual of meaning, to stop her from turning her own death into testimony. But they failed, because the thread did not mute her presence. It magnified it. The blade was lifted, the rope was tightened, the drum rolled once, then stopped. She did not close her eyes. In the final moment, she remained exactly as she had been since the beginning, untouched in her defiance, untouched in her awareness, untouched in her unwillingness to allow the state to speak on her behalf. The blow came cleanly. Her body fell, but the silence did not lift. It thickened. As the executioners moved to remove her remains, the spectators remained still. There was no cheer, no calls for justice, no satisfaction, just a silence that mirrored hers, heavy, slow, dangerous. Later, they would bury her in an unmarked grave. The thread was never removed, no relic kept, no sermon given. Her name was omitted from public records, her writing seized, her memory forbidden from statues or stained glass. But memory cannot be erased by decree, and mutilation does not produce obedience, it produces memory. They had hoped to end her legacy with silence. Instead, they replaced her voice with something even more enduring, the image of a woman who died with her mouth sewn shut, but with her eyes wide open. History tends to remember the ones who spoke, but it never forgets the ones who were silenced with violence. The woman with the stitched mouth left no last words, no martyr's monologue, no written legacy discovered in some secret cell. But she left something heavier, a question. One that lingers in every regime that crushes voices before the body. Why sew a mouth shut if death is already certain? Why mutilate the voice if not because it held the power to unmake the lie? Her execution was meant to be an ending, but it functioned as a mirror, reflecting not just her suffering, but the fear of those who inflicted it. Fear that words might outlive the blade, that memory might breed resistance, that silence might speak louder than confession. In their effort to control the narrative, they revealed their weakness. They showed that it was not violence that sustained their rule, but the absence of truth. And the moment that truth threatened to speak, they reached not for argument, but for a needle. She was not the first to be punished for speech, and she will not be the last. From tongues cut out to books burned to bodies disappeared, systems of power have always known that a voice is more dangerous than a weapon, because a weapon kills, a voice converts, a voice reveals, a voice remains. So they silenced her with black thread, but the image could not be unstitched. And in that image lives a warning that there will always be those for whom truth is so unbearable they must destroy the very mouth that dares speak it. If you want to hear more of the stories they tried to bury, subscribe. We don't just remember, we reveal.